Okay, as with can't believe I just lost my page. As with any sort of thing dealing with the Soviet experience of the war, I thought it might be best if we start with a poem, right? Just because why not? This is a poem written by a Russian named Simonov, and it was a reiteration, basically, of one of the orders Stalin had given in 1941, which is basically fight to the death. It was passed out to all of their, it was passed out to the army. It was to be read by officers to their men more than once. The title of the poem, in case there's any sort of concern or any sort of question about it, the title of the poem was Kill Him. Just in case there was any sort of question about what the purpose of the war was and what the purpose of the German army in the war was. The title was Kill Him, and let me read to this, because there's actually some elements within this poem that I think help us understand a little bit about the Soviet war effort. If you cherish your mother who fed you at her breast, from which the milk has long since gone, and on which your cheek may only rest, if you cannot bear the thought that the fascist standing near her may beat her wrinkled cheeks, winding her braids in his hand, if you have not forgotten your father who rocked you in his arms, who was a good soldier and fell in the Carpathian snows, who died for the Volga and the Don, for the future of your native land, if you cannot bear the thought that he will turn in his grave, that his soldier's portrait on the cross should be smashed to the ground and stamped on by a German before your mother's eyes, then kill a German. Make sure to kill one. Kill him as soon as you can. Every time you see him, make sure that you kill him every time. The end. Yeah. So you can see that there's a lot at work there, believe it or not. It's not just go out and kill a German soldier. There's actually a lot within that poem about how the Soviet state responds. And so I want to take today about that sort of two parts to this, which is how does the Soviet Union, now that it's finally been plunged into war, despite Stalin's miscalculations, his mismanagement of the military and intelligence before the war, how does the Soviet Union fight? And perhaps more importantly, the question that has concerned historians for a long time is just why did so many people fight so hard for this regime? A regime which had at times terrorized its own population, had uprooted them, had imprisoned them, had brutalized them. What is it about the Soviet Union in the early 1940s? What is it about the Soviet population that makes them fight so hard? What is it that ultimately enshrines, not just in Soviet memory in the middle of the 20th century, but also in Russian memory to this day, this moment is what they call the Great Patriotic War. Now seen as sort of, in essence, a Russian triumph, not a Soviet triumph, but it's something that still occupies an enormous space in Russian cultural memory. So that's what we want to tackle today, sort of how the Soviets fight this war, and then why the Soviets fight so hard. As I've mentioned, for the European theater, this is really the central area that matters. That is, the German control of the western part of Europe, as I mentioned before, had been simply an adjunct to the larger purpose of establishing autarky, establishing Lebensraum, and control of all of this area. The Soviet Union contained grain in Ukraine. It contained all sorts of precious metals. It contained coal and iron ore. As you got down here towards the Black Sea, it had oil. That is, the Soviet Union, or at least this part of the Soviet Union, up to and including Moscow, contained so many fundamental things that were required for the Germans to establish autarky. This is the key area for the Germans. Everything else for the Germans is a sideshow. It's important, but it doesn't ultimately matter. As we've talked, the failure to knock Britain out, the failure to somehow convince Britain to give up the war, will ultimately force the Germans to pay some attention to Western Europe, to build up their Atlantic defenses on the English Channel, to have to divert some resources from this. But this is the big one. The Germans launched the largest army Europe had ever seen in June 1941. 3 million men, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, horses, tanks, artillery pieces, railway cars. It is, for the Germans, the key to survival. It's also, and one of the things that's important is that this is seen as an absolutely fundamental fight for survival. Unlike the war in Western Europe, the war in Western Europe is not going to be fought necessarily on the ideas or within this sort of absolutely existential framework. That is, that we either win or we die. We either win or our nation collapses. That's the image, or that's the fundamental motivation here, on both sides. One interesting thing is that, and we'll be talking about this in a comparative sense later on, we talk about the Pacific and East Asia, this is a race war. Ideas of race are absolutely important to how this war begins, how this war will be fought. This is especially true on the German side. For the Germans, this is a war, first of all, against Slavs, people perceived to be inferior. People who at best will be almost sort of semi-human labor, unskilled labor, for producing goods and producing resources for the 1,000-year Reich, but nothing more. It's also, as I've mentioned, we talked about the incursion into Poland last week, this is also bringing the Germans into control of a much larger number of Jews. And the invasion into the Soviet Union is going to ultimately force the Germans, or not force the Germans, but put the Germans in a position where they no longer believe they can simply force Jews out of German-controlled territory, but they will now need to take the next step and begin to eliminate them. It's a process which had started sort of informally in Poland, but starting in late 1941, early 1942, it's a policy that will gain much more sort of official sanction in the Soviet Union. The presence of millions of European Jews in this region is ultimately going to lead, as we'll talk about on Thursday, ultimately going to lead German planners at the start of 1942 to begin to formulate basically a mechanism, an entire system for the extermination of Jews. So the invasion here, basically, it brings home the idea that you have all of these Jews now under German control and no way to get rid of them except to kill them. By January 1942, you have being put into place a plan, an actual sort of schematic and orchestrated plan to exterminate millions of people. So this is, in two ways, a race war. It's also, you might say, a race war in the way in which the Germans themselves formulated. The German plan for this war is based in large part on the idea that Slavs are inferior. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, others, that they are all going to, in essence, or that they may fight for a little while, but they do not have the wherewithal, the character, or the intellect to stand up to this massive German force. And remember, this is a German army, a German high command, a German leadership, Hitler namely, who believe that Blitzkrieg, who believe that this lightning war is going to knock out the Soviet Union psychologically, is going to undermine any spirit that's there to fight in the first place. So you have these assumptions going in, these racial assumptions on the German side. For the Soviets, it's much less going to be about racial assumptions than it is going to be about pure existence, pure survival. As you can see even in that poem. That is, the Germans are coming for you, they are coming for your family, they're coming for your mother, they're coming for your wife and your children. And it's one of the things that Stalin and others are going to work very hard. They won't have to work too hard because, of course, what the Germans do is enough at times to remind people just what the stakes are. But they will work very hard to try to get people to understand this as a war of survival. So while it's a race war on the German side, on the Soviet side, it's much more this sort of existential conflict. It's a war for their very existence. From the start, you might say that this idea of this being sort of a war of extremes, or a war of racial extremes in particular, is echoed in words by the Nazi leadership. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, said at the start of the war, we are not, this is his quote, we are not waging war to conserve the enemy. That is, he wasn't even worried necessarily about labor or keeping POWs alive. Whether they live well or are racked by hunger only interests me so far as we need them as slaves for our culture. In fact, the Nazis will take close to 6 million prisoners of war. 3.5 million will die. There are no rules out here. There are no Geneva Conventions. There is no idea of military law. It's a very different conflict than what's fought in Western Europe. The Germans and the French, and the British and the Canadians and everyone else, where there are these sort of rules. With the idea of POWs being treated according to certain ways. This is not. This is a war for survival and a war for annihilation. All these rules are off. All bets are off. One of the reasons why, as we'll see, when the Soviets do begin to push back, the Soviets are as brutal as the Germans had been. Not only in the reoccupation of Soviet lands, but ultimately in the actual occupation of Germany. As I've said before, the Germans are fighting this war ultimately to create the capacity for autarky, to create their ability to survive on their own, to be completely self-sufficient. They don't have it yet. That's one of the things driving the Blitzkrieg approach. It's one of the things driving this effort here. The Germans are well aware that they have to act quickly, they have to strike quickly, and they have to achieve a fairly swift victory. Because they know that the Soviets, if they have anything, they have resources. What the Germans seem to have done is not necessarily to underestimate Soviet resources, but to underestimate Soviet resourcefulness. I'm very proud of that line right there. Which is the ability of the Soviets to adjust, to rally their population, to rally the people, and to move troops, to move material quickly, even under very extreme conditions. The idea for the Soviets was that, or for the Soviet leadership, was to, once Stalin had survived, as I mentioned, the idea was to get the Soviet people to do two things. First of all, they had to marshal all the resources they could, and they had to make sure that the Soviet people would fight until the end. That is, they could only use all of their resources if they could delay the Germans, if they could, in essence, slow the Germans up. A lot of the initial Soviet response to the German invasion, especially the Germans moving north here towards the city of Leningrad, what is now, again, St. Petersburg, a lot of this involved almost literally throwing Soviet citizens in front of the oncoming Germans. In Leningrad, they recruited something like 100,000 volunteers, gave them barely any training, and shoved them out into the field, in the essence, to be cannon fodder, to be basically human roadblocks, human speed bumps, to slow down the advance of the Germans. They didn't slow it down much, but they did at times slow it down enough. And this is what will happen throughout this region. That is, that in the late summer and early fall, the Soviets will be able to move people. They'll be able to motivate people to get into a position where they can block the German advance. it's not necessarily it's not necessarily going to stop the Germans, but it will slow them down. As I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how this plays out, and I'm going to talk about some of the motivating factors here. For the Soviets, the idea was to slow the Germans down, because by the end of September, in this area, you start to see the transition. Fall lasts about one afternoon, somewhere in early October, and then it's winter. And the Germans were not prepared. They didn't necessarily, despite the 3 million men, despite all of the planning that went into this, the Germans were still governed by this idea that they were going to win fairly quickly. And some of the problems with the Blitzkrieg approach begin to emerge by the fall and early winter of 1941. That is, you do have some groups who move fairly quickly, but they outstrip their supply lines. Furthermore, this is such a heavily mechanized operation, as the Germans tended to do, or had done since Poland in 1939. This is so heavily mechanized, it's dependent on infrastructure. And the Soviet Union, for all its advances, did not have the road and rail networks yet that the Germans have found, for example, in Western Europe. The Germans hadn't had to worry about this in Poland because their knockout of the Poles had been so swift. But in the case of the Soviet Union, they begin to run into logistical difficulties. Moving supplies, moving men, in particular, moving fuel. A mechanized force only lasts as long as it has gas for the tanks and the trucks and the transports. So by the fall of 1941, you were starting to see, again, especially in this region here, a real sort of overextension of some German forces. And when the Soviets manage to slow them down, they make the German problem worse because they make the war last longer. So you have overextended forces, it's more difficult to supply them, and the winter's coming. For example, the Germans were so confident, the Germans had not, in their logistical plans, the Germans had not accounted for the use of antifreeze. They didn't have any antifreeze, which meant the German tanks and German trucks froze. The Soviets had antifreeze. The Soviets had lived through, shall we say, the Soviet winter before. So the Germans are scrambling. They don't have enough coats. They don't have enough winter boots. They're going to have trouble moving food. They're going to have trouble keeping troops warm. So the initial idea of sort of slowing down the advancing Germans does reap some benefits. By December 1941, the Germans had gotten fairly close to Moscow. But they were ultimately stopped because of the enormous sacrifice that the Soviet people made to, in essence, throw up literal barricades in roads to offer themselves up as basically cannon fodder. There was panic in Moscow. In December 1941, there was panic. The police, there were reports people wrote in their diaries, things that were only found much later, when archives opened up and people actually sort of felt willing to share with historians and museums and others what their records they had kept of this period. They recorded, people were tearing up their Communist Party membership cards, police were fleeing, administrators were fleeing. The Germans ultimately are stopped, but it's a close-run thing. They're stopped literally because this takes too much time. They have outstripped their supplies, and they have to basically stop and retrench. Stop, resupply, in essence, sort of recharge their forces during the winter. But to give you an idea of the cost of this, between June and December 1941, the Germans lost a quarter of all their forces, of the 3 million men. Somewhere close to 750,000 people, 750,000 soldiers, either killed or wounded. most in the period from about September to December, as the Soviets began to slow them down. The Soviets, as I mentioned, just in this period alone, had 3.5 million prisoners of war taken and lost 2.7 million dead. Numbers of wounded sort of even beyond that, just simply astronomical. So you have this situation where the Soviets are ultimately able to slow down the Germans enough. They can't get to Moscow. The Germans will encircle Leningrad. Leningrad, for about 2 years, is going to be besieged. The Soviets completely mismanage Leningrad in terms of getting people out of Leningrad before so the Germans are able to close all the way around it. The Soviets are late in evacuating women and children. Ultimately, they get about 500,000 people out of Leningrad before the Germans completely surround it, but that leaves about 2 million people who are ultimately blockaded in by the Germans here and by the Finns here. One of the strange sort of developments of this war, and you tend not to think of Finland much in the Second World War. The Finns fight on the side of the Germans out of revenge for the Soviet attack and the Soviet conquest of Finnish territory right here in 1939, 1940.
So special a few months ago, they were the only foreign country to have their own censorship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they were, and I mean, and it's something that the Finns have tried, in essence, to play down ever since. Yeah, it's like it never happened. You know, or if it did, well, you know, it wasn't
us, the SS,
it was a German SS. Well, they just have, the Finns have this, you know, I mean, the Scandinavian countries themselves were either sort of under German occupation, or like the Swedes, they were neutral. The Finns sort of stand out because they fought with the Nazis, which no one really wants to be associated with, I think, understandably. So it's sort of this product, this byproduct of what the Soviets had done. But the Finns are basically cutting off Leningrad from the north, the Germans from the south. About half the population left in Leningrad dies. That is, close to 1 million people will die during the siege of Leningrad. It's generally seen as the fact that the Soviets struggle in the first part of the war organizing logistics, organizing the movement of people, especially the most vulnerable people, out of harm's way. But it's also the fact that Leningrad itself never falls. The Germans actually decided they were not going to try to take it. But the people of Leningrad never actually surrender is another sort of sign that the Germans, the Soviets were going to hold out even under very extreme conditions. For the Soviets, one thing that was going to be key, as I said, was sort of blocking and delaying the Germans. This is especially true as the Germans begin in the spring of 1942 to move to the east again. Again, trying to cut off this area, the Crimea, the area in the Black Sea, ultimately moving, not on this map here, ultimately moving towards a city called Stalingrad, which Hitler, for some reason, becomes obsessed with. That's another thing that's key to the Soviet survival, is that the Germans are being commanded, ultimately, by someone who's not entirely in control of himself. Someone who changes the military objectives rather sort of haphazardly.
Well, was Stalingrad like one of the biggest losses for the Nazis?
It's going to be the big one. It's going to be the big one because Hitler becomes sort of obsessed with it because it's called Stalingrad. He thinks you wipe out this, you knock out the Soviet spirit. And so he's going to throw an enormous amount of resources into a place which doesn't really matter. Rather than taking Moscow, rather than concentrating on linking up and using Romanian troops, the Romanians are fighting in here too, by the way, on the side of the Germans, to sort of consolidate control in the southern Soviet Union, he becomes obsessed with Stalingrad. And at Stalingrad, you start to see some of the Soviet strengths emerging. One thing I had mentioned before was that the Soviets are going to make it very difficult. This is Stalingrad, 1942. The Soviets are going to make it very difficult to fight. On the retreat of the Soviet army towards Moscow in late 1941, in the fighting at Stalingrad, they are going to create what you might call, or they're going to wage what might be called a scorched earth campaign. They're going to destroy everything. The Germans will have no resources to draw on. Plow under fields, blow up dams, destroy roads, blow up bridges. The Soviets were terrible, by the way, at blowing up bridges. They tended to blow up a bridge only after about half the retreating troops had gotten across. This became almost of a running joke, which is that if you didn't get across in the first 10 minutes, they were probably going to blow it up and leave you stranded on the other side. This is Stalingrad. The idea was to make the terrain absolutely punishing and to draw the Germans, not only to slow them down, but to ultimately draw them, this is where Stalingrad becomes Hitler's greatest mistake, to draw them into urban fighting. In essence, the Soviets were quite happy to reduce cities and towns to rubble, to create this urban battlefield that favored them. Streets full of rubble mean you can't move tanks. A city full of abandoned and bombed out buildings allows for snipers, allows for pockets of resistance to emerge. So as even the Germans are restarting their offensive in the spring of 1942, the Soviets have had time to further, you might say, sort of scorch the earth, to destroy resources. And the Soviets have had time to do a couple of other things too. Late in 1941, of course, the Americans come into the war. The Americans are going to be able to provide the Soviets with aid. Not until late 1942 does the aid become anywhere substantial, but the entry of the Americans into the war, and especially the fact that the Americans are fighting the Japanese, creates sort of a quandary for the Soviets. The Soviets know that the Germans and the Japanese have this alliance, have this bond. Cemented as the Axis. But what they don't know is this, is that the Japanese, what the Soviets hadn't realized for a while, was that the Japanese had basically formed this tripartite alliance with the Germans and the Italians, with the understanding that they would never actually have to fight with the Germans and the Italians. The Japanese were concentrated in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. They didn't want to concentrate anywhere else. So what's built into there is that they will provide each other with material and with funds if necessary, technological transfers, things like that. But they're not going to actually fight. And in 1941, when Japan goes to war, or when Japan and the United States goes to war, Stalin is concerned. Are the Japanese going to come after him? Because all of a sudden, the Soviets are an American ally, the Japanese are now at war with America. The one thing the Soviets have, and this is largely a product of the pre-war extensive extensive pre-war construction of an intelligence system. The Soviets had spies, intelligence assets, as they called them, throughout the world. Some were people who had been recruited into the Communist Party. Some had sort of recruited themselves into the Communist Party. Some the Soviets just quite literally managed to pay enough to spy. But the Soviets had established, really, the only working and effective global intelligence system by the start of the Second World War. Stalin didn't listen to it a lot, but it was there. And one of the assets was a German, a secret communist, who worked at the German embassy in Tokyo and read all the telegram traffic between Berlin and Tokyo. That is, what the embassy told Berlin, what people in Berlin told the embassy to tell the Japanese government. And he knew with certainty that the Japanese were not going to jump into the war against the Soviets. And by the end of December 1941, Stalin knows that for certain as well. And this is hugely important for the Soviets because while the Soviets had initially 2 million men to fight the Germans in the summer of 1941, they had kept about 1 million in the far east of the Soviet Union, guarding against potential Japanese incursion from northern China, from Manchuria. Once they know, with a great degree of certainty, that the Japanese are not coming after the eastern part of the Soviet Union, they can move all those troops. Much of the Second World War, the eastern part of the Soviet Union is undefended. Japanese have no desire to get involved in that. And it allows Stalin, during that lull from late 1941 through the summer of 1942, to move 1 million fairly experienced troops into place near cities like Stalingrad. and to have this resource. So while the Germans in the winter of 1941-1942 have about 250,000 men lost simply to frostbite and exposure when they are unable to get their tanks moving again. They don't have enough diesel fuel like the Soviets had laid in. You have a Soviet Union which has been able to delay them and which now has the capacity to resist them actively. Not necessarily to take the initiative yet, but to resist actively. In late 1942, the summer of 1942, and into 1943, the Soviets first turned back the Germans at Stalingrad and then begin to push them actively back to the west, encircling them, using their tanks to great advantage. The Soviets have not had their resources destroyed. Among the things that were retrieved or were evacuated from Leningrad were factory workers, engineers, whole factories worth of equipment relocated to the east of Moscow, across the Ural Mountains. This massive human effort. It's not only the people fighting, but it's people literally carrying factory machinery, tools, generators, over the mountains to reestablish them in these new industrial cities that Stalin had founded further east. So the Germans, by failing to take control of Leningrad, by failing to get to Moscow, allow a lot of these resources to slip to the east. Labor goes east, machinery goes east, technology goes east. You have one further thing that will ultimately help them. Just as Stalin had basically issued an idea that you will fight to the death, there will be no retreat, by the summer of 1942, for Hitler, Stalingrad had taken on the same importance. And he refused to let his troops retreat from what was, in many ways, already an untenable position. Troops extended too far to the east into Stalingrad, a place that didn't actually matter. A place where ultimately 200,000 Germans are going to die in this one city, and where another close to 100,000 are going to surrender in late 1942 and 1943. So you have this, basically, the Soviet ability to take the hardest hit that the Nazis could organize. It's an ability based on lots of things. Based on the fact that the Nazis get overextended, the Nazis are overconfident, that the Soviets do have resources. Very few other places in the world, in fact, nowhere else in the world, could simply reach out and get another 1 million soldiers into action from their eastern frontier, the way in which the Soviets could. You have a willingness of the Soviet leadership, we'll talk about, not only to encourage people to die and to fight to the death, but also to, in essence, destroy the Soviet Union in order to save it. Reduce it to rubble so that you could fight the Germans on sort of equal terms. You could eliminate the Germans' mechanized advantages. By July 1943, the tide had really turned. The Soviets are beginning to push the Germans back to the west by 1944. Leningrad, the siege of Leningrad will be lifted, and the Soviet army will be speeding rapidly towards Germany. As I said, there are multiple keys to this reversal. It's the ability of the Soviet Union to take this initial blow, the fact that the Soviets had so much space into which they could retreat, the willingness of the Soviet leadership and the Soviet people to, in essence, sacrifice themselves, to certainly sacrifice their property and their livelihoods in order to slow down the Nazis. The total dead for the Soviets is going to be close to 9 million soldiers by the time they have pushed the Germans entirely out of Soviet territory in early 1944. Then they will fight through Poland and then into Germany itself. It's just under 9 million. 8.7 million soldiers die. And we've talked about some of the elements, that is, the Soviets preserving resources, the Soviets slowing down the Germans. There's a couple elements in the German, too. There's Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad. There's the fact that Hitler actually was a more rigid military commander than Stalin was. That is, Stalin, I don't want to say to his credit necessarily, but Stalin realized that he was only going to be able to defeat the Germans if he allowed his commanders, at times, to have some leeway in what they did. To engage at times in tactical retreats, to engage at times in maneuvers that looked like they were giving ground, to preserve resources, to rest men, to at times sort of entice the Germans to come further than they ought to have. For Stalin, this was very difficult. But Stalin showed, and we'll talk about this in a second, Stalin showed great, you might say, ideological and political flexibility in preserving himself. I mean, they went to the gulags. They went and they found guys who had been purged from the Soviet army in the 1930s. Said, you've got to get back out there. We need you. We need your ability to think about logistics and strategy. As I said, with Hitler, you have, in a sense, someone who's much less pragmatic. Someone who is very rigid. It's a very strange thing. Someone who demands absolute authority and absolute obedience, and he gets it, but the problem is he's changing his mind every week about what he wants to do. And there's no one in the army. Hitler had been so successful, and Hitler had established himself as so popular and as potentially so sort of, knowledgeable and correct in his earlier military ventures that no one was willing to question it. It's only after 1942 and the raving insistence on Stalingrad that you even start to see members of the German military begin to think about how they can get rid of Hitler. That is the whole idea that there was, resistance. There was a resistance in Nazi Germany, but it wasn't largely among the officers. It wasn't, Tom Cruise in Valkyrie or something like that. That's not driven by the sense of, my goodness, we just discovered this is an extremely evil man. It's rather, we just discovered this extremely evil man is now losing us the war. There's a difference there. There were other German resistance groups, but the ones in the army that turn on Hitler in 1943 are driven much more about the fact that he has proved to be a disaster as a military leader. Having given him, in some ways, or having sort of acceded to his control of the military for a long time, they try to get it back. They fail. But it's, again, Stalin, strangely, is more flexible than Hitler is. Hitler's flexible in what he wants, but he's not flexible in sort of delegating authority or allowing any challenges to his authority. Stalin is. So what I want to do now is the question of why did so many fight so hard? We talk about, these enormous sacrifices, people existing in besieged Leningrad, people tearing up their farms, people fighting, people serving almost as sort of human shields to slow down the German advance. This is a question that's really interested Soviet historians recently. Why do these people fight so hard? It's a question, why are so many people, or at least why do there used to be so many people in the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s, at the time of great changes, who said we need another Stalin? Why were these people so devoted? And there's several elements to it that I just want to show you, and I'll show you because it illustrates sort of the depths to which Stalin was willing to go, ideologically and politically, in order to fight this war. The multiple messages that were, you might say, sort of transmitted to the Soviet people, and then ultimately what historians have concluded about the workability or the efficacy of these messages, and other reasons, perhaps, that they might have fought on. Remember, this is a place where not only are people fighting, but there's enormous sacrifices on the home front. Between June and December 1941, the Soviets relocate physically, sometimes using railways, sometimes using human transport, using trucks, using mules and horses. They relocate 3,000 factories to the east of Moscow between June and December 1941. It takes an enormous amount of effort. It takes a huge human toll. You have huge food shortages during the war, not just in besieged places like Leningrad, but throughout the Soviet Union. During the entire war, grain output is cut basically in half. That is, the amount of grain that had usually sustained the Soviet population is cut in half. In part because large parts of the Soviet grain reserves had come from Ukraine, which was largely under German control. But it's also because an enormous amount of labor had been drained from the collective farms to go and fight. You had this massive drop in livestock. I just want to talk about the fact there's no grain. There's also no meat. Again, because of the massive fighting in the western part, the major agricultural areas, the number of cows in, I guess what we considered Soviet territory, drops 50% between 1941 and 1943. One of the things that's going to be very interesting is when the Soviets come into Germany in late 44, early 1945, they are not only intent on smashing Germany, but they are basically going to loot the eastern half of Germany to make up for, in some sense, to make up for what has been taken from them under German occupation of places like Ukraine. One statistic estimated that the Soviet army ultimately stole 23 million pigs in Poland and eastern Germany over the course of the war. They also stole 1 million bathtubs. No one's ever been able to quite figure out what they did with them. But they took everything that wasn't nailed down, and then they took the nails and took everything that had been nailed down. And you'll see this in the book, Woman in Berlin, where she'll be assigned to help basically strip a factory. And the Soviets didn't do much with it. They had a lot of rusting. There are Soviet scrapyards, or former Soviet scrapyards, that still exist in Russia today that have, for example, German railway lines, German rolling stock, that have been there and rusting for 70 years because the Soviets took it as both punishment for the Germans and to try and reconstruct what had been lost. In the countryside, those areas not taken by the Germans, because you have a dramatic drop in livestock, not only in sort of cows, dairy cows, beef cattle, all available horses, mules are taken to either move factory equipment or to work in support of the military. Women plow the fields. Literally 2 or 3 women working in a team pulling a plow while someone else guides the plow behind them. So there are these enormous sacrifices asked of people. And the question is just how do you get people to sacrifice so much? People have suggested various solutions. Historians have suggested various solutions. Let me give you a couple of them that have been tossed out. Because they all factor in, although some turn out to be more important than others. The first is fear. That is that the Soviet army, or the Soviet leadership, especially in the summer and fall of 1941, basically decided that the best way to get people to fight was to shoot them if they didn't fight. That there would be massive arrests, transportation to the Gulag for defeatism. Anyone mentioning what was actually happening in the war could be arrested for defeatism and either shot or sent off to a labor camp. Defeatism wasn't simply saying, we're lost, Stalin has not prepared us for things like that. It could simply be if you came in and said, by the way, there's a German tank out there. This happened in Leningrad. People said, the Germans are 40 miles this way. I just saw them. You could be arrested for defeatism. What was called Sovinform, which was the Soviet news agency during the war, people had to learn to read the code. That is that, if areas were seeing vigorous fighting, it meant the Germans were there. If they were seeing heavy fighting, it meant the Germans were winning. If they saw intensive fighting, it meant the Germans had won. So they never actually admitted that the Germans were anywhere victorious, but instead just kept saying, the fighting continues. People tended to be told where the Germans were about 2 weeks after the Germans had got there. So that the Soviet news agencies could basically coordinate their response. The idea was to basically instill fear in people of talking about the war. You have orders issued to the military. In August 1941, there's Order 270, which said that all troops who are captured by the Germans are to be branded enemies of the motherland. Traitors to the motherland. It's very interesting, by the way, they will use the word motherland. We'll talk about this momentarily. So in August 1941, Order 270 from Stalin, all POWs are to be considered traitors. This is problematic for Stalin because his son is taken prisoner around this time. His son is later killed, supposedly trying to escape from a German POW camp. In many senses, that solved some of Stalin's problems because of what to do. Because if your son was captured, the general practice had been to imprison the rest of the family, send them off to a labor camp, things like that. You have the notion that POWs are traitors, which plays out at the end of the war too. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war come home and instantly fall under suspicion that they had not surrendered, but they had defected, that they had betrayed the Soviet Union. That is, lots of Soviet soldiers who had spent the war and survived German POW camps did not want to go back to the Soviet Union in the summer, fall of 1945 because they knew what awaited them. Many of them were going to wind up in the Gulag. And many of them did, at least for a period of 2 to 3 years. You have the Americans, in particular, engaging in delicate negotiations about returning Soviet soldiers. Soviet POWs who refused to come, and ultimately the Americans almost forcibly sent about 1 million Soviet POWs back from the American sector of Germany after the war. Many of them to their deaths, or at least to long-term imprisonment in the Gulag. You had, for example, in the retreat from Leningrad, or in the attempt to evacuate people from near Leningrad, you had a Russian naval convoy that was put together in the fall of 1941. It turned out to be a disaster. They were harassed by everything from German submarines to Finnish speedboat and motorboat patrols. A captain of one of the major Soviet escort vessels, they were hit by artillery. Actually, the Germans they had to sail so close to land to avoid German mines that the Germans could fire on them from the shores of places like Estonia. They were hit by artillery. He was knocked unconscious and fell overboard. He was rescued by a smaller Soviet vessel. When he got to was returned to the Soviet Union itself, he found that the rest of the crew, who had managed to guide the ship safely to port on an island off of Leningrad, they were all given honors. He was executed for desertion because obviously he was knocked unconscious voluntarily. And it is true that in the fall and early winter of 1941, Soviet field hospitals were reporting an enormous number of self-inflicted wounds. Lots of people with wounds in their left arms and their left legs. Which means that when the Soviet defense has to gear up again in the summer of 1942, Stalin issues perhaps his most famous order, Order 227, which is not one step backwards. Order 227, July 1942 in Stalingrad. Not one step backwards. The Soviet army would use specific battalions to either execute those who attempted to retreat or capture them and then use them as basically human minesweepers or mine detectors to march in front of troops. It didn't last enormously long, this not one step backwards. In fact, the Soviets denied that it ever existed, this order existed, until a historian found it in 1988, just after the Soviet archives had begun to open up a little bit. And it was something that everyone had suspected that Stalin had issued this order, but no one was willing to actually admit it until they found it. And it does literally say not one step backwards. And it assigns punishment battalions, or basically execution battalions, to take care of those who are retreating, not just deserting, but even sort of falling back from certain positions. In the first 4 weeks of the Battle of Stalingrad, 13,000 Soviet soldiers were shot for retreating, for desertion, for cowardice, whatever they wanted to call it. Eventually, the Soviet general stepped in and said, "This is really terrible for morale." And Stalin actually listened to them. They said, it's terrible for morale. We need to be able to exercise certain tactical retreats in order to resupply, in order to suck the Germans further into a place like Stalingrad. And if you keep shooting people for that, we're not going to have an army left. Soviet military said, the people are willing to sacrifice, but it's eventually going to get too much. So after about a month or so, this practice was, if not stopped, was at least sort of was decreased. The problem was, that the fear was not the best solution. As I said, officers said it was terrible for morale. The army had been so fearful in the run-up to the war that no one had told Stalin anything. And even Stalin seemed to realize this by the summer of 1942, that he had to, in essence, sort of let his military commanders do more, listen to them more, and try much less to institute sort of fear, or institutionalized fear. There's a couple of other things that are also important that show just how Stalin pulls off the stuff. I talked about the fact of the idea of traitors to the motherland. I talked about in that poem, the idea of a motherland comes up. This is not a phrase that the Soviet leadership had used. But under Stalin, a lot of the Bolshevik rhetoric and a lot of the Bolshevik presentation of what it means to be a Soviet citizen gets thrown out the window. Especially once Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics states like Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania, once they're taken, this becomes very much a Russian fight. And for Stalin and for the Soviet leadership, they very consciously try to play up the Russian element again. In organizing recruitment, they say this is Mother Russia calls you. Basically, Mother Russia demands. This is not imagery that had been around in the 1920s and the 1930s. Talk about motherland. It had been talk about the great Soviet state. But it hadn't been talk about Mother Russia because, of course, the Soviet Union included lots of people who weren't Russians. But now that you have this situation of the Soviets being pushed to the extreme and the fact that it's now going to basically be up to the Russian population of the Soviet Union to push the Germans out, they go back to this. There are posters celebrating medieval Russian heroes, like, for example, Alexander Nevsky, 1242-1942. That is, the Russians who had fought off German invaders, the people who have been the leaders of what we call the small sort of principalities in the western part of Russia before the actual emergence of a Russia itself. These names are conjured up. Again, sort of Alexander Nevsky, medieval heroes. You see here Germans being sort of cast now in this sort of medieval idea on horseback, as well as, of course, with their tanks and machinery here. But the idea is that you're going back to this. You're going back to pre-Tsarist Russia here. But you don't ignore the Tsars even. This is what's sort of amazing about, is that another way of inspiring people is to turn Hitler into who, do you think? Napoleon. Of course, who defeated Napoleon? The Russians, led by the Tsar. That is, the regime the Bolsheviks had overthrown is now, in essence, resurrected to inspire people. One of the things that Stalin does is he reopens the churches. The clergy can go back in and hold services as long as they're explicitly praying for the salvation of the Soviet Union. But the Russian Orthodox faith is now re-legalized, or at least the practice of it is re-legalized, especially in Moscow. The minute the war is over, all the churches are closed down. So you have this essence of this idea of sort of creating a Mother Russia idea, an ancient Russian idea. Not relying on sort of Soviet-style propaganda of a state, and not, and this is really interesting, not relying on Stalin. A lot of the propaganda is not geared to the idea of fight for Stalin. It's fight for Russia, fight for your family. You see in that poem, Kill Him? Nothing in there about fighting for the future of socialism. Nothing in there about what you owe to Comrade Stalin. It says, remember your father dying in the Carpathian snows. That is the area near Romania, where the Russian army had fought in World War I against the Austro-Hungarian army. Again, the Tsar's army. Remember your father who fought for the Tsar and died bravely in the Carpathian snows. So again, you are relying on these images of the past, images that are very much redolent of this sort of ethnic Russian attitude, not necessarily of the Soviet state.
How soon after the war was it changed back to Soviet?
Oh, almost immediately. Almost immediately. I think by the end of the summer 1945.
Literally like reading war.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, everything that had happened during the war, of course, never actually happened. Yeah, the churches were closed and boarded up. Clergy were sent back. I mean, that's one of the reasons why you have, so many prisoners of war sent to the Gulag. It's not simply that this order had been given, encouraging people to fight by saying you'll be a traitor if you surrender, but also it's a way of eliminating from public memory people who were failures during the war. You can't have the great patriotic war remembered as a triumph if you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about, boy, Stalin wasn't ready for this. So you have, again, very selective sort of memory used during the war and after it. You do have appeals. Protect your women and children here at the point of the bayonet. You have who will protect me? This one says. Again, the idea of sort of children being abandoned. This is not about fighting for Stalin. It's about fighting for the innocent. What's interesting, of course, is this is a regime which had depended on and which had encouraged the use of children as sort of agents of the state, as we talked about with the famine in places like Ukraine. You have children sort of employed to represent the state, to instill fear in their parents. But now, in the Second World War, these children are sort of recast as the innocent victims of Hitler. Again, everything that was in the past, as we said, East Asia has always been at war with Eurasia. Oceania has always been at war with East Asia. So it's these sort of manipulations that are key, at least in part, to raising spirits, at least among the Russian population, to fight back against the Germans. The big thing is this: if it's not this sort of patriotism, this religious rhetoric, this idea of a mother Russia, this appeal to protect your families and your children, well, that all does seem to have had some impact, and fear seems to have played a role too. What historians now really credit is something else, and this is something I touched on before. This is a miner who became famous in the 1930s. His name was Stakhanov. S-T-A-K-H-A-N-O-V. Stakhanov. And he was a miner who had supposedly mined, if everyone else was getting about 1 ton of coal mined a day, he did something like 8 tons of coal in a day. He was commemorated. He worked night and day. He worked under all conditions. He didn't want any glory for himself. He was doing this all for the state. And Stakhanov is sort of memorialized throughout the Soviet Union. Stakhanovite practices or Stakhanovite commemorations are organized for those who also demonstrate enormous self-sacrifice. And this goes back to this, it goes back to the idea of the children being agents of the state in the 20s and 30s. Those children, those younger adults who really were only educated in a Soviet system, post-1920, who were brought up to believe in sort of the importance of the state and the importance of sacrifice to the state, who were given idols like Stakhanov, who were ultimately sort of fully imbued with this notion that the greatest thing you can do is sacrifice for yourself for the state. These are the people who are in their early 20s at the start of the war. These are the people who are going to bear the bulk, or the brunt, you might say, of the fighting. These are people who have built into them this enormous idea of sacrifice. And while some at times may be cynical, some at times may be regretful about what they're doing, or about the circumstances they're in, there is going to be this willingness. That is, no matter how many people that were shot, how many people whose families were sent to the Gulag to inspire them to fight harder, it wasn't more than a couple of percent of the people fighting for the Soviets. Everyone else, the people fighting, the people moving the factories, the people willingly serving as sort of human shields. I was just reading about a great description of this in Leningrad in the fall of 1941, of people signing up, especially university students, engineering students, medical students, signing up to basically be given no training, very little in the ways of weapons or ammunition, and going out and just sort of running at the Germans. There is this element within the Soviet state that exists. Not even begun by Stalin, but fostered even before Stalin. From the days of sort of the Bolshevik triumph in the Russian Civil War and the emergence of a Bolshevik-led society in the early 1920s. That this idea that you sacrifice for the state. The state, in turn, many people believed, it will move you out of poverty. It will give you education and housing. That this loyalty to the state is repaid. That there is this greater good. It's identified at times as Stalin, but during the war, it gets sort of blurry. Is it Stalin? Is it Mother Russia? Is it your family? But this idea of sacrifice remains fundamental. That is, it's almost sort of a default category of existence in the Soviet Union. People are accustomed to sacrifice. People are accustomed to harsh conditions. People are accustomed to having a lot asked of them and a lot demanded of them. And so they respond. So it's a key, the Soviets have resources, the Soviets pick up key allies, the Soviets have intelligence, they benefit from German miscalculations and German arrogance, but they also have a population which uniquely is prepared for this type of war of survival. Because they have been brought up in a system which has enshrined sacrifice and duty, and enshrined relationship to the state and devotion to the state over anything else in their lives. So when you look at how and why the Soviets are able ultimately to be the power that turns back Nazi Germany, that ultimately destroys Nazi Germany, it's due to this. A population which was, of all the populations that fought in this war, uniquely prepared to engage in this sort of existential war. All right, on Thursday, we're going to start talking about the particular element of this war in this part of the world. That is the emergence of what we now think of as the Holocaust itself, the actual construction of the death camp and extermination camp system. All right, I will see you all on Thursday. Thank you.